stay quiet, and don't move. That was the first thing I ever said to him, and it was also the moment my life stopped belonging to me. The night it happened, I was 3 hours into a double shift, my feet aching in side shoes that were half a size too small, the kind you buy on clearance because rent doesn't wait for comfort, and the restaurant smelled like expensive wine and polished wood, the kind of place where people spoke softly but spent loudly, where a single dinner bill could cover my groceries for a month. And I remember thinking how strange it was that the rain outside sounded louder than the conversations inside, tapping against the floor-to-ceiling windows like it was trying to warn someone, maybe me, maybe him I didn't know yet. My name is Emily Carter, 24 years old, waitress, invisible to most people who walk through those doors. And that night should have been like any other, balancing trays, forcing smiles, counting tips in my head before I even earned them. But then he walked in. You don't need someone to announce a man like Adrian Blackwood. The room does it for you. Conversation slow, heads turn just enough to pretend they're not staring, and even the air feels different, heavier, like it knows something you don't. And I remember gripping my tray a little tighter, not because I was afraid, but because something about him made everything else feel smaller. He wasn't loud, didn't need to be, just a dark suit that fit too perfectly, a presence that didn't ask for space but took it anyway. And when he sat down in the private section, the kind reserved for people who never wait, I told myself he was just another rich man, just another table, just another tip, but my instincts have never lied to me. And that night they started whispering before anything even happened. It was subtle at first, the kind of detail most people miss, a glass placed slightly off, a man standing just a second too long behind his chair, a look that didn't match the smile on his face, and I shouldn't have noticed. I should have kept my head down, refilled water, walked away, because girls like me don't get involved in things that don't belong to us, but something felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, like a thread pulled loose in a perfect suit, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. I moved closer under the excuse of clearing plates, my hand steady even when my chest wasn't, and that's when I caught it. Not words exactly, more like fragments, enough to understand but not enough to forget, and suddenly the room didn't feel warm anymore, the light didn't feel soft. Everything sharpened, edges where there shouldn't be edges, and I realized I was standing in the middle of something I wasn't supposed to see. I could have walked away then. I should have. I tell myself that even now, because the truth is no one asked me to be brave. No one asked me to care, but I looked at him, really looked, and for a second, just 1 second, he didn't look like the man everyone feared. He looked like someone about to be blindsided by something he couldn't see coming. And before I could think, before I could stop myself, my feet moved, my voice followed. Low enough that only he could hear me, steady even though my heart wasn't. Stay quiet and don't move. And that was the moment everything changed. He did not move, not even a fraction of an inch, and for a second I thought maybe he had not heard me. Maybe the noise of the room swallowed my voice the way it swallowed everything else that did not belong. But then his eyes shifted just slightly, not toward me, but toward the reflection in the glass behind me. And that was when I understood something about Adrian Blackwood that no one had ever told me. He did not react. He calculated, even in silence, even in stillness, he was already 3 steps ahead of whatever danger I had just stepped into. My hand hovered near his glass, pretending to adjust it, my fingers brushing the edge just enough to make it look natural, just enough to hide the fact that I was shaking, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but inside my pulse was loud, too loud, like it was echoing in my ears, and I kept my voice low, barely more than breath. There is something wrong. I did not know why I said it that way. Not direct, not clear, just enough to plant the idea, because something told me that. Saying too much would be worse than saying nothing at all. He did not look at me. Not yet, but his hand stilled on the table, fingers resting beside the untouched drink, and the man standing behind him, the one I had noticed before, shifted his weight again, just a little too tense for someone who was supposed to be relaxed. And I felt it then, the moment stretching, tightening, like the air before a storm finally breaks, and I knew we were out of time. Now, I whispered, barely audible, and I reached for a napkin that was not there, letting my body lean forward just enough to disrupt the perfect stillness of the table, just enough to create a reason for him to move without making it obvious. And for the first time, his eyes met mine, sharp, assessing, not confused, not surprised, just aware, like he had been waiting for confirmation of something he already suspected. He stood, smooth, controlled, as if this was all part of the evening, as if nothing had changed, and the second he moved, the tension in the room snapped, not loudly, not in a way that anyone else would immediately understand, but I felt it, the shift, the subtle wrongness turning into something real, something undeniable, and the man behind him took a step forward that he should not have taken. I stepped back, heart racing now, no longer quiet, no longer contained, and I forced myself to keep walking, to keep moving like I belonged there, like I had not just interfered with something far beyond my world, because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean fear, and fear would show, and showing was dangerous. Behind me, I heard movement, chairs scraping softly, voices lowering instead of rising. And that was worse somehow, the quiet control of it all, like whatever was happening was already decided, already handled, and I realized I had not just stepped into a moment, I had stepped into a system, one that did not leave loose ends. I reached the service station, gripping the counter, as if I needed balance, as if I had simply been working too hard, too long, and I told myself to breathe, in through my nose, out through my mouth, the way I always did when things felt like they were slipping out of control, but it did not. Work. Not this time, because this was different. This was not a spilled drink or an angry customer. This was something that followed people home. Emily. My name stopped me colder than anything else could have, and I turned slowly, already knowing who it was before I even saw him, already feeling the weight of his presence before his eyes locked onto mine again. Closer now, sharper, and there was something new in them, something that had not been there before, not just awareness, not just calculation, but recognition, like I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. You knew, he said, not accusing, not questioning, just stating a fact, and I opened my mouth to deny it, to say I did not know anything, that I had just been doing my job, but the words caught in my throat, because we both knew that would be a lie. I saw enough, I said instead, my voice steadier than I felt, and for a moment, neither of us moved, the noise of the restaurant fading into something distant, something irrelevant, and I realized then that whatever I had just done, whatever choice I thought I had made in a split second, it was not over, it was just beginning, and the way he looked at me made one thing painfully clear: I was no longer invisible. I should have walked away after that, gone back to my section, finished my shift, pretended none of it had anything to do with me. But my feet stayed exactly where they were, like the floor had decided for me that I was not leaving yet. And the way Adrian Blackwood looked at me made it impossible to pretend this was just another moment that would pass without consequences. He did not raise his voice, did not step closer in a way that would alarm anyone else. But the space between us felt smaller anyway, charged with something I could not name, and I became painfully aware of every detail, the faint scent of his cologne, clean and sharp, the quiet precision of his breathing, the way his gaze did not flicker or soften, just held steady like he was measuring something he had not decided on yet. You saw enough, he repeated, softer this time, as if testing the weight of my words, and I nodded before I could stop. Myself, because lying felt pointless under that kind of attention, like trying to hide in a room with no shadows. Around us, the restaurant continued, plates clinking, low conversations rising and falling, but it all sounded distant now, like I was hearing it through water, and I realized something else. No one was looking at us. Not really, which meant they knew better, which meant whatever world he belonged to had rules that extended far beyond what I could see. You should not have involved yourself, he said, not harsh, not angry, just certain, and that somehow made it worse, because it meant he believed it completely, that people like me stayed in our place, and survived by staying invisible. I did not think, I admitted, my voice quieter now, honest in a way that surprised even me. I just saw it. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, like that answer mattered more than anything else I could have said. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching again, but this time it was different, not tense, not waiting, just heavy. Then he glanced past me, just briefly, and I followed his line of sight without meaning to, catching the same man I had noticed earlier moving toward the exit, too quickly, too carefully, like someone trying not to be seen while already knowing they had been. And something in Adrian's expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a door closing somewhere deep behind his eyes. Go home, he said suddenly, his voice low but firm, the kind of tone that did not invite argument, and I blinked, caught off guard by how simple it sounded compared to everything else that had just happened. What? I asked before I could stop myself. And he looked back at me, really looked this time, not as a stranger, not as part of the background, but as a variable he had not planned for. Your shift is over, he said, even though we both knew it was not. You should not be here anymore. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd, like he could just decide that for me, like he could rewrite my night with a sentence. And maybe that was exactly what he was used to doing, changing outcomes, controlling variables, making decisions that other people had. To live with, but something in me resisted, something small but stubborn. I cannot just leave, I said, glancing toward my manager across the room, toward the life I understood, the rules I followed, the paycheck I needed. I work here. For the first time, there's a flicker of something in his expression that almost looked like frustration, not directed at me, but at the situation, at the complication I represented, and he exhaled slowly, like he was recalculating again. Then listen carefully, he said, stepping just close enough that I could hear him without anyone else noticing, his voice dropping into something quieter, more controlled. Whatever you think you saw tonight, you forget it, you do not repeat it, and you do not try to understand it. My heart tightened at that, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of what he was asking, no, what he was telling me, and I realized this was not just about protecting himself. It was about protecting me in a way that felt strange coming from someone like him. And if I do not, I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out because something in me needed to push back, needed to know where the line actually was. His gaze held mine for a long second, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, but somehow more final. Then you will not like what happens next, he said, not as a threat, but as a truth, and that was when I understood this was not a warning meant to scare me. It was a boundary meant to keep me alive, and somehow that made it even harder to ignore. I should have nodded, should have agreed, should have taken his warning and folded it neatly in his silence the way people like me are supposed to. But something in his tone stayed with me. Not the words themselves, but the way he said them, like he was not trying to control me. He was trying to place me somewhere safe in a situation that had already gone wrong, and that realization did something unexpected. It made me hesitate instead of obey. You do not get to decide that for me, I said quietly, and the second the words left my mouth, I felt the weight of them, felt how out of place they sounded in a world where he clearly made the rules, but I did not take them back. I could not, because for once I needed to know that I still had a choice, even if it was a small one. His jaw tightened just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to see that I had crossed into unfamiliar territory. Not danger exactly, but resistance. And for a moment I thought he might push back, might remind me exactly who I was talking to, but instead he exhaled slowly, like he was forcing himself to be patient with something he did not fully understand. This is not about control, he said, his voice lower now, more measured. This is about consequence. The word lingered between us, heavier than anything else he had said, and I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry, because I understood that, even if I did not want to admit it, I understood that actions did not exist in isolation in his world. They echoed, they returned, they demanded something in exchange. I glanced toward the entrance, half expecting to see something, someone, but everything looked normal, too normal, like nothing had shifted at all, and that made it worse because it meant whatever had happened was already being handled in ways I could not see, and the idea of invisible consequences settling in a place around me made my chest tighten. Then tell me what happens next, I said, softer this time, not defiant, not challenging, just honest, because I was already in this, whether I liked it or not, and pretending otherwise would not change that. His eyes studied me again, longer this time, like he was searching for something, maybe fear, maybe regret, maybe a reason to dismiss me entirely. But whatever he was looking for, I did not give it to him, and after a second, something in his expression shifted, not softened, but adjusted, like he had reached a conclusion he was not entirely comfortable with. Next, he said slowly, you finish your shift. I blinked, surprised, because that was not what I expected, not after everything, not after the warning, but he continued before I could question it. You act like tonight was ordinary, he added, because for you, it needs to be. There was something deliberate in the way he said that, like he was building a version of reality for me to step into, one that did not draw attention, one that kept me out of reach of whatever had been set in motion. And I realized then that he was not just giving me an order, he was giving me a strategy. And you? I asked before I could stop myself, because if I was supposed to pretend nothing happened, what did that mean for him, for the world he clearly could not just walk away from? A faint, almost humorless curve touched his lips, gone as quickly as it appeared. "I handle what is mine," he said, and the words carried a quiet finality that made it clear there was no space for further questions. Not about that. Not about anything beyond what I needed to know. For a moment, neither of us moved, and I felt the distance between our worlds more sharply than ever. The line that separated someone like him from someone like me, power and survival, control and adaptation. And yet, somehow, that line had blurred just enough for us to be standing here, having this conversation as if it made sense. Then he stepped back, the space returning, the invisible barrier resetting itself. And just like that, the moment shifted again, becoming something that could pass as normal to anyone watching, something that could be forgotten if I chose to forget it. But as I turned to walk back toward my section, picking up my tray, forcing my shoulders to relax, my expression to settle into something familiar, I realized I would not forget, because even if I pretended, even if I followed every instruction he gave me, something had already changed, something quiet but permanent, and I could feel in the way my heartbeat refused to return to normal, in the way every sound felt sharper, every movement more deliberate, like the world had tilted just enough, that I could never stand the same way again. And as I moved through the tables, refilling glasses, nodding at customers, doing everything exactly as I was supposed to, I kept hearing his voice in my head, not the warning, not the command, but the part he did not say out loud, the part one somehow understood anyway, that this was not over, not for him, and definitely not for me. The rest of my shift felt like walking through a version of reality that no longer fit quite right, like everything looked the same but carried a weight it did not have before. And I moved on instinct more than thought, refilling glasses before they were empty, clearing plates before anyone asked, smiling at customers whose faces I would not remember, because my mind kept circling back to the same thing, the way Adrian had looked at me when he said to forget, the way it did not sound like a suggestion, but also did not feel like a threat, and that contradiction stayed with me in a way I could not shake. Time stretched strangely after that, minutes folding into each other until I could not tell if an hour had passed or only 10, and every time the door opened, every time a shadow shifted in the corner of my vision, my chest tightened just a little, expecting something to happen, something to break the illusion of normal, but nothing did, and somehow that was worse, because silence leaves too much space for imagination. By the time my shift finally ended, the restaurant had thinned out, the late-night crowd replaced by quiet tables and low lights, the kind of calm that feels earned after chaos. Except tonight there had been no visible chaos, only the memory of it lingering beneath the surface, and I untied my apron slowly, fingers clumsy from exhaustion and something else I did not want to name. "You look like you have seen a ghost," my coworker Jenna said as she passed by, her tone light, teasing, unaware, and I forced a small smile, shaking my head like it was nothing, because explaining was not an option, not when I barely understood it myself. "Just tired," I said, and that part at least was true. Outside, the rain had not stopped, the pavement slick and reflective under the streetlights, turning the city into something softer, almost unreal, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I stepped out, the cool air hitting my face like a reset I desperately needed. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing, letting the sound of rain fill the silence in my head, try to convince myself that whatever had happened inside could stay there, contained, separate from the rest of my life. But deep down, I knew it would not be that simple. I started walking, heels clicking, against wet concrete, the familiar route to my apartment, just a few blocks away, close enough that I never felt the need to take a cab, and I told myself to focus on that, on the ordinary rhythm of my steps, on the glow of storefronts and passing headlights, anything that anchored me back to something normal. Halfway down the block, I felt it, not a sound, not a movement, just a shift in awareness, the kind you cannot explain but cannot ignore either, like the world has tilted just enough to let you know you're not alone. And I slowed without meaning to, my breath catching slightly as I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing obvious. No one standing too close. No footsteps echoing behind mine. Just the rain, steady and indifferent, and the empty stretch of sidewalk reflecting distorted lights. I almost laughed at myself then, a quiet, nervous sound, because maybe Adrian was right. Maybe I was letting my imagination get ahead of me. Maybe there were no consequences waiting just around the corner. Maybe I could go home, shower, sleep, and wake up to a version of the world that still made sense. I turned back forward, picking up my pace just a little, not running, not panicking, just moving with more intention. And that was when I saw it, a black car park along the curb ahead. Engine running, lights off, the kind of detail that should not have mattered but suddenly did, and my steps slowed again despite myself. I told myself it could be anyone, a driver waiting, someone checking directions, something completely harmless, but then the passenger door opened slowly, deliberately, and I stopped without realizing I had, my heartbeat rising again, louder now, impossible to ignore. A man stepped out, tall, composed, his presence unmistakable even before the light caught his face, and I did not need him to speak to know who it was, because somehow, part of me had already expected this. Adrian Blackwood did not belong in my world, not on a quiet street after midnight, not standing a few feet away from where I lived, and yet there he was, rain catching in his dark hair, his gaze steady as it found mine like it had been searching for me all along. "I told you to go home," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm for the situation, and I swallowed, trying to steady myself under the weight of everything that moment carried. "I'm going home," I replied, gesturing weakly toward the building behind me, but he did not look convinced, not because of where I was standing, but because of what he knew that I did not, and the way he studied me now was different from before, less distant, more deliberate. "No," he said quietly, shaking his head once. "You are not safe here tonight." And just like that, whatever illusion of normal I had been holding on has slipped completely out of reach. The words did not register right away. Not fully, because part of me was still standing in the version of the night where I could walk upstairs, lock my door, and pretend everything would reset by morning. But the way Adrian said it, calm and certain, like he was stating something already decided, not something that might happen, made it impossible to ignore. "What do you mean I'm not safe?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended, because even asking felt like stepping further into something I did not understand, and the rain filled the space between us, soft but relentless, like it was trying to wash the moment away and failing. He did not answer immediately, and that silence told me more than any explanation could have, because if it were simple, if it were something I could fix or avoid, he would have said it already. Instead, he took a step closer, not threatening, not forceful, but close enough that I could see the fine details I'd missed before, the faint tension in his jaw, the way his eyes moved briefly past me before returning, always aware, always calculating, and I realized this was not about convincing me. This was about deciding what to do with me. "You were seen," he said finally, each word measured, deliberate, and my stomach tightened instantly, because I knew exactly what he meant without needing him to explain it further. I had not just noticed something tonight, I had been noticed in return, and that changed everything. "I did not do anything," I said quickly, the words coming out sharper than I expected, like I could undo the situation by denying my role in it. But his expression did not change, not even slightly, because this was not about what I had done, it was about what I knew. "That does not matter," he replied, and there was no cruelty in it, just truth, the kind that does not bend to comfort. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and I felt the weight of the street around us, the empty sidewalks, the dark windows, the way the city suddenly felt less like a place I belonged and more like something I was moving through without protection, and I wrapped my arms around myself without realizing it, not from the cold, but from the awareness settling in. "So what happens now?" I asked, softer this time, because the question no longer felt like defiance. It felt necessary, like I needed to understand the rules if I was going to survive whatever came next. His gaze held mine for a long second, And something shifted there again, not distance, not control, something closer to decision, like he had reached a point where waiting was no longer an option. "You come with me," he said, simple, direct, leaving no room for misunderstanding, and my breath caught slightly, not because I did not expect it, but because hearing it out loud made it real in a way nothing else had yet. "I cannot just go with you," I said, even though part of me already knew that I could, that I might have to, but saying it felt like holding onto the last piece of control I had left, and he tilted his head slightly, studying me again, not impatient, not dismissive, just certain. "You can," he said, his voice lower now, quieter in a way that made it more serious. "Because staying here is not an option." The words settled into me slowly, not like a command, but like a fact I had not wanted to face, and I looked past him for a second at the familiar entrance to my building, the place that had always meant safety, routine, something predictable. And for the first time, it did not feel like enough, not against whatever world he was trying to keep me out of. "For how long?" I asked, because if I was going to step into this, even temporarily, I needed to know where it ended, needed to believe it would end at all. His expression did not change, but there was a pause, brief, almost imperceptible, before he answered. "Until I know you're not at risk," he said, and the way he phrased it told me something important. This was not about convenience, not about control for its own sake. This was about removing a problem, and right now, that problem was me being exposed. I exhaled slowly, my mind racing through possibilities, through reasons to refuse, through consequences I did not fully understand, and none of them felt solid enough to stand on. Not compared to the certainty in his voice, not compared to the way my instincts were telling me that whatever had started inside that restaurant had not ended when I walked out. "If I say no?" I asked, one last attempt to draw a line, even if it was only for myself, and his eyes softened just slightly, not in a comforting way, but in a way that felt almost honest. "Then I stay," he said, and that was when I understood this was not a choice between going with him or walking away. This was a choice between accepting his protection or facing whatever came next alone, and suddenly neither option felt like something I could fully control. The rain continued to fall, steady and quiet, as I stood there, caught between two versions of my life, the one I knew and the one I just stepped into, and for the first time that night, I realized that going back might not be possible anymore. I stood there a second too long, caught between instinct and logic, between the version of myself that wanted to say no and the one that already knew I could not, because nothing about this night had followed the rules I was used to, and pretending I still had control felt more like denial than choice. The rain soaked through the edges of my jacket, cold against my skin, grounding in a way that made everything else sharper, more real, and I exhaled slowly, steadying myself the only way I knew how. "Fine," I said finally, the word quieter than I expected but heavier than anything I'd said all night, and his expression did not change, not relief, not satisfaction, just a small shift in posture like a decision had been confirmed. He stepped aside without another word, opening the passenger door, as if this had already been arranged, as if there had never been another outcome, and I hesitated for just a fraction of a second before moving, my feet carrying me forward even while my mind tried to catch up. The inside of the car was warm, the leather seat soft beneath me, the faint scent of something clean and expensive replacing the cold air outside, and the door closed with a quiet finality that made my chest tighten slightly, like I had just stepped into a space where the rules were no longer mine. He walked around to the other side, sliding into the driver's seat with the same controlled ease he carried everywhere else. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the sound of rain tapping against the windows filling the silence as the engine hummed softly beneath us. "Where are we going?" I asked after a second, my voice steady but careful, because everything about this situation felt like it required precision, like saying the wrong thing could shift something I did not fully understand. He adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, eyes forward, focused in a way that made it clear he was already thinking several steps ahead. "Somewhere secure," he said, not vague, but not specific either, and I nodded slowly even though the answer did not give me much, because I had the feeling that details were not something he gave freely. The car pulled away from the curb, smoothly, merging into the empty street with quiet confidence. And I watched the city slide past the window, familiar buildings and intersections passing by in a blur that felt strangely distant, like I was already stepping out of the life I recognized and into something else entirely. I wrapped my arms around myself again, not from the cold this time, but from the awareness settling deeper with every passing block, and I glanced at him briefly, studying the profile I had only seen across a table before, sharper now in the dim light. More human, and yet somehow more distant at the same time. "Do you do this often?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because curiosity had always been my weakness, even when it was not safe, and his eyes flicked toward me for a split second before returning to the road. "No," he said simply, and something about that answer felt more honest than anything else he had said. "Tonight." "Then why me?" I pressed, softer this time, because if I was going to be pulled into this world, even temporarily, I needed to understand why I was not just another problem to solve and forget. His jaw tightened slightly, not in irritation, but in thought, like he was choosing his words more carefully than before, and for a moment I thought he might not answer at all. "Because you acted," he said finally, his voice lower now, quieter in a way that felt more personal. Most people would have stayed silent. The words settled into me slowly, unexpected in their simplicity, and I looked down at my hands resting in my lap, fingers still slightly tense, as if they had not caught up to the rest of me yet. "I almost did," I admitted, barely above a whisper, because that was the truth. I had hesitated, I had considered walking away, and maybe in another life I would have. There was a brief pause, the kind that does not feel empty, but full of something unspoken. And then he spoke again, softer than before, almost reflective. "But you did not." I glanced at him again, and for a second, just a second, the distance between us felt smaller, not gone, but less absolute, like we were both aware of the same moment, the same decision that had changed everything, and neither of us could ignore it now. The car turned onto a quieter street, the city lights thinning out, the buildings growing taller, more private, and I felt it again, that subtle shift, like I was crossing a line I could not see, but would not be able to step back over easily. I leaned back against the seat, exhaling slowly as I tried to steady the thoughts racing through my mind. And I realized something I had not allowed myself to admit before. This was not just about danger, not just about staying safe for a night. This was about being pulled into a world where choices carried weight I was not used to, where a single moment could change everything. And as the car continued forward into the quiet, I understood that whatever came next, I was already part of it. The car slowed as we turned into a private drive, the kind you do not notice unless you are looking for it, partially hidden by tall hedges and subtle lighting that made everything feel intentional without being obvious. And I straightened slightly in my seat without realizing it, my attention sharpening as the city noise faded behind us, replaced by something quieter, more controlled. The gates ahead opened before we even stopped, smooth and silent, like whoever was inside already knew we were coming, and that realization settled into me in a way I could not ignore. This was not just a place, it was a system, one that moved before you asked it to. We drove through slowly, the tires barely making a sound against the pavement, and I caught glimpses of the building as we approached, tall but understated, all clean lines and dark glass, the kind of architecture that does not need to impress because it already assumes it will, and I felt the distance between my world and his stretch even further, not just in money, but in control, in design, in the way everything here seemed to operate without friction. The car came to a stop near the entrance, and for a second I did not move, my hand resting lightly against the door handle as I took in the moment, the quiet, the absence of chaos, the contrast to everything that had happened just hours ago, and I realized something strange. I did not feel afraid in the way I expected, not exactly. What I felt was something closer to awareness, like I was stepping into a place where every move mattered. Adrian stepped out first, walking around to my side without hesitation, opening the door before I could decide whether I was ready or not. And I looked up at him, searching his expression for something, reassurance, maybe, or at least clarity, but what I found was the same controlled focus he had carried all night, steady, unreadable, and somehow that steadiness made it easier to move. I stepped out, the cool air brushing against my skin again. Lighter here somehow, less heavy than the street we had left behind, and I followed him toward the entrance without needing to be told, because at this point the path had already been set. Inside, everything was quiet, not empty, but quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like even sound was managed here, the lighting soft but precise, the floors reflecting just enough to make every step feel measured. And I became aware of the subtle details, the way a man near the hallway straightened slightly as we passed, the way another nodded almost imperceptibly, not to me, but to him, and I understood then that this was not just his world, it was an extension of him. We moved through the space without stopping until we reached an elevator tucked discreetly at the end of the corridor, and he pressed a button without looking, the doors opening almost immediately as if they had been waiting, and I stepped inside with him, the small enclosed space suddenly making everything feel closer, quieter, more focused. "You will stay here tonight," he said as the doors closed, his voice calm, not asking, not commanding, just stating what was already decided, and I nodded slowly, because arguing here felt unnecessary, like pushing against something that had already accounted for resistance. The elevator moved smoothly, no jerking, no sound, just a steady rise that I felt more than heard. And I watched the numbers change, each floor marking the distance from the life I had known just hours ago. And I wondered briefly how something so small, a choice to speak, a moment of instinct, could carry me this far so quickly. "Will anyone come looking for me?" I asked quietly, the question forming before I could stop it, because even now, even here, the thought lingered, the idea that whatever had started was not fully contained. He did not answer right away, and I felt the pause, measured, intentional, before he spoke. "Not tonight," he said, and there was something in his tone that made me understand the rest without him needing to say it. Tonight was handled, but that did not mean everything was over. The doors opened onto a private floor, the space beyond even quieter than the one below, and he stepped out first, waiting just long enough for me to follow, and as I crossed the threshold, I felt it again, that subtle shift, like I had stepped fully into something I could not step back out of easily. He led me down a short hallway to a door that opened into a room that was both simple and precise, nothing excessive, nothing unnecessary, everything in its place, and I paused just inside, taking it in, trying to anchor myself in something solid. "You can rest here," said, stepping back slightly, giving me space in a way that felt intentional, and I turned toward him, a question forming that I had not fully thought through. "And you?" I asked, because despite everything, despite the distance between us, the control, the certainty, I realized I did not fully understand where he stood in all of this. He held my gaze for a second, and for the first time since the night began, there was something there that felt almost human, not softer, not weaker, just more real. "I do not rest," he said quietly, and then he stepped back, the distance returning, the moment closing before I could hold on to it, and I realized then that whatever world I'd stepped into, it did not pause, it did not slow down, and neither did he. The door closed behind him with a quiet click that echoed louder than it should have, and for a moment I just stood there, still, listening to the silence settle into the space he had left behind, like the room itself was adjusting to my presence, recalibrating around someone who did not belong here. I let out a breath I did not realize I'd been holding, my shoulders dropping slightly as the tension in my body shifted, not disappearing, just changing shape, becoming something quieter, more internal, like a question that had not found its answer yet. The room was simple in a way that felt intentional, nothing excessive, nothing out of place, a bed perfectly made, a chair angled just enough to face the window, soft lighting that made everything feel calm without being warm, and I moved slowly, almost carefully, like I was afraid of disturbing something I could not see. I set my bag down on the edge of the chair, my fingers lingering on the fabric for a second before pulling away, and I walked toward the window, drawn by the faint reflection of the city beyond the glass. From up here, everything looked smaller, quieter, the streets reduced to lines of light. The movement of cars softened into something distant and almost unreal, and I pressed my hand lightly against the cool surface, grounding myself in the only way I could. Just hours ago, I had been part of that world, walking those streets, thinking in terms of shifts and tips and rent due dates, and now I was here in a place that felt removed from all of it because of one moment, one decision, one sentence spoken without thinking. Stay quiet and don't move. The words replayed in my mind, clearer now than when I had said them, and I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the weight of them settle deeper, because it was not just what I had said, it was what came after, the chain of events that had followed without pause, without giving me time to step back or reconsider. I turned away from the window slowly, taking in the room again, searching for something familiar, something that felt like mine, but everything here belonged to him, to his world, his rules, and I realized that even the silence was different, not empty, but controlled like it existed on purpose. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress firm beneath me, and I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees as I tried to slow my thoughts, to organize them into something that made sense, but they refused to settle, circling the same points over and over again. He said I was not safe. He said I was seen. And then he brought me here. The logic was clear, simple even, but the reality of it felt heavier, like there was more beneath the surface that I could not yet see. A soft sound in the hallway pulled my attention. Not loud, not urgent, just a shift in the quiet that made me look up instinctively. And for a second, I considered getting up, opening the door, asking the questions that were building inside me. But I stayed where I was because something told me that answers here did not come easily, and asking too soon might not change anything. Instead, I leaned back slowly, letting my body rest against the headboard, my gaze drifting back toward the ceiling as I exhaled again, longer this time, letting the tension ease just enough for exhaustion to take its place. It hit me then, suddenly and completely, the weight of the night catching up all at once, the hours of standing, the constant alertness, the emotional strain of stepping into something I had never imagined being part of, and my eyes closed before I could stop them. But even as sleep pulled at the edges of my awareness, my mind did not fully let go. Images flickering behind my eyelids, the restaurant, the moment I spoke, the look in his eyes when he realized, the way everything shifted after that, and then his voice calm and certain, cutting through it all. You were seen. I opened my eyes again, staring up at the ceiling, because something about that stayed with me, not just as a warning, but as a connection, a link between his world and mine that had not existed before tonight. I had stepped into it, even if I did not mean to, and now it had followed me here, into this room, into this silence, into whatever came next. I turned my head slightly, glancing toward the door, half expecting it to open, half expecting him to step back in and say something that would make all of this clearer, simpler, but remained closed, still leaving me alone with my thoughts. And that was when it settled in fully, not as fear, not as panic, but as something quieter and more certain, a realization that did not need to be spoken out loud to be true, that whatever I had stepped into tonight, whatever connection had been formed in that moment between us, it was not temporary. It was not something that would fade by morning, because people like Adrian Blackwood did not forget, and neither, I realized, did I.